morning and happy hump day. Today is Wednesday, February 1st, 2023. With me today, I have the guy who made Drake's new Rolex Daytona Paul Newman happen. He's the one that actually, helped facilitate the transfer of ownership from the original owner to Drake. I have Adam Golden from Menta Watches. Welcome, Adam. How are you?
Hey, how's it going, Avi?
Can't complain. Another beautiful day here.
Yeah.
As you can see, I'm not in our regular studio. I'm in my office because this is the only way I can get it to work to do this kind of Zoom situation with you. I wanted to start by asking you, what part did you play, or how did this happen? How did it come about? How did Drake reach out? What happened here? Tell me the story.
So to be fair, I didn't talk to Drake directly. He has his watch people that he deals with. I was approached by Joey Kalika, who's the wrist watcher, to look for if I had a reference 6239 Paul Newman. It's the same exact version that Paul Newman himself wore in stock, or if I could source one for him because a high profile client, Drake, was going to be getting it as a birthday gift, no less. Somebody was purchasing it for Drake as a birthday gift.
So he didn't even buy it himself.
What's that?
He didn't even buy it himself. Somebody was buying it for him.
No. It's interesting. So unfortunately, I literally had just had a perfect example in stock, or a really, really good example in stock, but Joey was like a day too late. And it was a time crunch because his birthday was coming up in like 10 days or so. So it didn't work out on this first example because I just sold the watch, and I'm like, dude, I'm really sorry. And he's like, can we get it back? I'm like, listen, it's gone. It's not able to be repurchased. But lo and behold, Roman and I, shockingly enough, like 2 weeks ago, had been discussing with one of his contacts in Canada about this original owner, Paul Newman. We were going back and forth. It was the jeweler was the middle guy to the original owner. He knew nothing about this watch.
I'm going to pass on a picture of the original owner. It's this sweet old guy that you met.
Yeah, getting ahead of ourselves. So that's the original owner. But anyways, Roman's jeweler contact had access to this guy. He wanted to sell the watch. His family and his kids didn't want the watch. Didn't know what to do, didn't really understand pricing, or, he had a good idea of what it was worth, but and the jeweler guy knew nothing about this watch. He sent us a bunch of pictures, and Roman's like, hey, do we have something here? And I'm like, listen, the guy's had the watch since new. The crystal was scuffed up to all hell. It was really hard to tell the condition of the watch. And so I'm explaining to Roman already knew, but I'm explaining to the jeweler guy, because we're on the phone, three of us, at like 10 o'clock at night on like a Wednesday. I'm like, listen, if the watch has any defects on the dial, if there's a scratch that a watchmaker scratched it by accident, or there's a little piece of the luminous material, the lume that chipped off, like, we're talking not just a few $100 value difference. We're talking could be thousands, could be tens of thousands. So unless we get better pictures, there's really nothing we could do. Fast forward like another week, he gets somewhat. I'm like, listen, try to get the watch in your hand, take it by the windowsill, take some pictures in natural lighting as best you can, because the original owner didn't want to like leave it out of his sight. And I understand that. It's a valuable watch, and he wasn't used to the dealings the way we do business, like where it's like, okay, if you trust the other person, you could send them the watch even for inspection. Like if Roman or I want to buy a watch from each other, whether it's 20,000 or 200,000, we'll send it to each other for us to take a look before we have to commit to it, because we trust each other. This guy was very green. It was his only watch, so he wasn't going to do that. We got some better pictures of the watch, and I was confident that we had a winner here just based on the extra photos we got. But still, at that kind of price point, you need to be absolutely sure, because like I said, any small thing you miss could affect, not only the profit that you would have made, but you'll be into, the red very, very quickly, because the values swing wildly based on condition, especially on a Paul Newman.
Let me stop right there for a second, just to get an idea of, are you able to talk about the numbers, or at least ranges of what we're talking about here?
So we were talking in excess of 200,000. Okay. Like us purchasing it for over $200,000.
Continue.
At that point, yeah. So at that point,
it was. I'm assuming you flew out. I'm assuming you flew out to Canada to actually take a look at this.
So at this point, like, I'm working on my schedule. It didn't seem like on the seller side it was a huge rush for me to get out there. But also, the longer you let these things linger, maybe they talk to somebody else, maybe they get a second opinion. So you don't want to let it linger for too long. But Toronto is only like a 2.5 hour flight for me. But still, I got to actually go and do it. But at this point, Joey had stepped into the fold, and he was like, "Look, I really need to get this watch for Drake, for this client, to give to Drake as a birthday gift." And I'm like, "Well, listen, I've been working with Roman on this original owner one out of Toronto. It looks incredible, but I don't know if the stars are going to align because of the time schedule." I got back on the phone with the jeweler. We were able to push the schedule up like a week earlier than I was expecting to go. And I was happy to do that anyways, because again, I didn't want to lose the deal. You have to sometimes, be aggressive on these things so you don't lose the opportunity. And it also, was good that we had somebody who was ready to purchase the watch should it be what we thought it was. So I fly out to Toronto. I meet with the jeweler, sit in his office. The old man that you showed the photo of comes in with his wife. Really, really sweet guy. Purchased the watch brand new in the 60s. So he wore it for like 30 some odd years. And at some point in the 90s, he was in Munich on vacation or a business trip or something, and somebody grabbed his wrist and they're like, "What's that?" And not because they wanted to steal it or anything like that. They were just, "Oh my God, it's a Paul. Like, how much do you want for it?" In the 90s, mind you, these watches weren't worth their worth today. Depending on when it was, $5,000 to $10,000 to $15,000. Like, they were still very, very different from where they are now. But it was a watch that was gaining a lot of momentum and popularity at the time. And he was kind of like taken aback by that, he said. And he just, after that, put it in a safe and kind of forgot about it. He had it serviced twice at Rolex in Canada. Luckily, they didn't change a thing on the watch. The watch ended up being incredible condition. I mean, it was worn. We're talking about a watch 50 some odd years old. It was worn for sure, but the dial was immaculate. There was no missing lume, scuffed up crystal sure. Original bezel, original bracelet. It was really just like a collector's dream, So at this point, make the deal happen. Text Joey like, "Listen, here it is. We could sell it to Drake if you're the person." And I think I'm going to get a lot of shit, if I could say that on your podcast, if I mention who the person was buying it for Drake. I'll just say that it was a very famous professional athlete who was buying it to give to Drake as a gift. I guess it's nice to have nice friends because that's an awesome fucking gift. At that point, it was like, okay, I got to rush to get back home. And we're talking like now, like a 48-hour window. So I got to rush to get back home. And then I got to get it to Joey the next day, which happened to be a Saturday. So it's like, okay, well, with this value, how do you ship for Saturday? You could FedEx overnight, but our insurance is not going to cover that for the full value. Because now we're, $250,000 plus. Or we can milk it and they're going to charge us an arm and a leg. And they charged us I think it was I don't know, $2,000 to ship it overnight for Saturday, maybe even a little bit more. But it was something that needed to be, it was something that needed to be done. Whereas your standard overnight Malka shipment should be at that value, like $600-700. So anyways, we got it to him. The next wrinkle was, and I told Joey from the start, because obviously, the people buying this watch, the athlete and then giving it to Drake, are not very well versed in vintage Rolex, so they're paranoid. Like, how do I know what I'm getting is original, correct, good condition? And by the way, I got the original owner to write a nice little letter stating that he bought it in Toronto and he had it serviced only in Canada, and et cetera, et cetera. So I was like, listen, obviously, I stand behind every single watch I sell for life. If I tell you it's this for life. And if you find something different, return it at any time. I've personally sold a lot of these watches. I know what I'm looking at, and this was one of the nicest ones I'd ever seen. But they obviously can't just take my word for it. So what Joey was doing was that he took it to the Rolex AD in upstate New York, or I guess in where is it? Where's Joey from?
Staten Island.
Staten Island. Thank you. Sorry, I was drawing a blank. Staten Island. And they were able to take it to their watchmaker, who opened up the watch, assessed it, and he even was like, "Wow, this watch is incredible. I've never seen one so nice." Wrote a whole little letter, because they originally wanted to send it to Rolex Geneva, because Rolex now has this new heritage department that will assess and evaluate your watch, but that could have taken a year, and we're talking, we needed to get the watch for his birthday, which was on like Sunday. So they got it to the watchmaker over the weekend. He checked out the watch, agreed everything was amazing. I guess wrote a letter for the athlete who would be buying it to give to Drake. And that was basically it. So, both of us were kind of intricately involved in getting Drake that Newman. And I'm happy he got it because he's from Toronto. It came out of Toronto. Watch is in incredible condition. Like it's like a once in a blue moon you find an original owner, Paul Newman, like that and in that condition. Usually there's some small flaws and wear over the years. This really was an incredible watch. I'm not just saying that because it's his watch now. It truly was. Like I told GQ in the interview I just gave for them on this watch, I would have bought it regardless. It had nothing to do with Drake, whether or not you and I, being Luxury Bazaar and us meant to watches, we're going to buy the watch regardless.
Yeah. From what I read, this watch traveled throh Malcolm Amit or Ferrari Express, private jet, armored guards. How funny is it the fact that the watch was actually in Toronto and could have just been hand delivered?
Dude, that's honestly, and I said that too, but I think it was delivered to him at like a party in New York anyways, so it wouldn't have mattered. It would have had to come back to the States. Gotcha. But I said the same thing, like, hey, I could just leave it in Toronto, but they wanted to vet it themselves, which I totally get. We're talking about a lot of money, and like I said before, people who are not used to dealing in Paul Newmans. So, there's a lot of, unfortunately, bad watches out there or altered watches or messed with stuff. So they wanted to make sure that what they were spending their hard-earned money on was legitimate. So this is a reference 62239 Paul Newman. It is white dial. They call it a panda dial with black registers. The interesting thing about this reference in particular, this exact variant, is that this is the one that Paul Newman wore. There are a lot of different Paul Newman variants because they made these what's so-called exotic dials over different references. But this is the exact one that he wore. This is the same exact variant that was auctioned, a few years back for $17 or some odd $1 million. So it's considered the entry-level Paul Newman because for some reason it's the cheapest, even though for me it's the most special because it's the one that he wore. But
by he wore, you mean him himself personally, or just the same exact model as he wore?
Well, this is the same exact model and dial variant that he wore. So this,
but not the actual one that was on his wrist.
No. This is that one sold for like 17 million and change in like 2017. But this is like a copy of it. Is my point? Is that this is the exact reference and variant. So if you were looking at his wrist and my wrist in that photo, it looks the same. And they made other variants. They made a black dial version as well. They made some with Bakelite bezel, and then ones with later screw-down pushers as the Rolex Daytona evolved. But that's the one that he wore, and as you see on Drake's wrist right now. It's the same watch. So it's a special watch just because it's the one that Paul Newman wore. So when you're talking about the Paul Newman, like that's it. That's the one. There's a lot of different variants and other models and variants are called the Paul Newman Daytona just because they have that same exotic dial, but that's the exact one that he wore.
All right. And can you get a little bit deeper into the numbers? So he bought it around the 200,000. Are you able to talk about how much you sold it for, or at least like what your typical margin on watches of this magazine?
I mean, so listen, we paid, we bought this in partnership together. You guys were kind of like a silent partner on this. We paid a little over 200,000 for it. I think I'm not being cagey. It's just I don't remember exactly. I think we paid like 215, and we sold it for 250 to Joey, or allowed him to resell it at his cost of 250. So we had like a $35,000 profit margin or something like that, so somewhere around there for us to split. I don't know what Joey sold it for. I can only imagine that he added on another 5 to 10%. To the AD that was sourcing it for the athlete to give to Drake. I can't speak to that. I can't imagine he threw on 100K and was like, oh, I want 350, but just because A, he doesn't seem like that kind of guy to me, and B, it would have been such an out of left field price, that it would have looked really bad if they had done some research and realized that there's a lot of cheaper ones out on the market. It was a fair price for the condition. Had we not gotten it to give to Drake, you know what I'm saying? Had Drake not been involved, we probably would have asked 285, 290 for the watch on a retail level. They're just very, very hard to find in that condition. And the difference in pricing on Paul Newman's, when you're talking about a perfect example versus one that might have had a few flaws or just not exactly perfect, can be 100,000 plus. You could buy a very weathered, scratched up, and just average Paul Newman in, like say the 120 to 150 range. But if you want a perfect one, you're paying 250 plus for that reference, for that exact variant. There's a huge delta.
Do you think that this watch will continue to increase in value, given how limited it is, how rare it is to find one in such good shape? I mean, so if Drake or whoever, let's assume somebody else purchased it, and they put it in a safe 10 years from now, are we looking at a significant increase or steady?
Yes. I mean, steady increase. Like these watches over the past 25 years have steadily increased. Like I said, in the 90s, they were 10, 15, 20 grand. And then they, went up to 60 to 80. Then they went up to 120. And now, we're talking, for great examples, 250 plus. And the great examples are so hard to find, and that delta that keeps growing between an average example and a great example is mostly because A, they're very, very difficult to find in great condition. And B, most of the buyers for this watch can afford to hold out and wait for a great example, and they'd rather pay up to have it because it holds its value better and it's more desirable. So I think you're going to see, if we look back at this interview or this podcast in 10 years and we look at the pricing, I think you'll see a standard, starter Paul Newman, like the one we're talking about now, reach $500,000. It might take 10 years to get there, but it's something that, again, Rolex doesn't produce anymore. They're extremely difficult to find in good condition. It's the most recognizable and iconic Rolex Daytona I think ever produced, especially because of the Paul Newman connection. There's collectors new and old. It's not just, if you look at some vintage Patek, for example, the really expensive stuff, the guys going after that generally tend to be the collectors who've been doing this for a long time and they're older. That's not to say that there isn't some younger generation getting in the mix, but it's primarily dominated by older collectors. When you talk about the Paul Newman Daytona, it's young, it's old, it's everybody in between. Everybody wants one, so I don't recognizable. Yeah, so I don't see the desirability or the collectability of that watch going down anytime soon. If anything, it's just going to continue to go up and up and up. It's just such an iconic watch. It's a grail for most people. Not a Paul Newman. Nice. It is a Daytona. Sorry, but it is not a Paul Newman. It is a reference 6265, so steel bezel with screw-down pushers, big red dial. Let me see if I can take it off and show you. So not a Paul Newman, but still a cool Daytona. Cool. The funny part is that when these watches were sold in the 60s and 70s, you could choose the Paul. It wasn't called the Paul Newman dial back then. It was just called an exotic dial, and there wasn't really much of a price difference between this normal dial. And by the way, Paul Newman also had one of these with a Bakelite bezel black dial, just non Paul Newman, not exotic dial, that he wore as well. But back in the 60s, 70s, you could walk into Rolex and pick whichever dial you wanted. There wasn't really a difference. Just one was called exotic, one was not. It wasn't until Paul Newman started wearing it and the Italians posted a photo. There's like an iconic photo of him like this, holding his arm up like this, where you could see that watch on his wrist in the late 80s, I think, when they found that photo, until people started calling that the Paul Newman Daytona. And that's when the popularity started skyrocketing. So if you had bought this watch in the 70s, you could have walked into Rolex and picked out this one or picked out the exotic dial one that now, in this case, sells for around $500,000. So if this watch on my wrist right now with screw down pushers had a Paul Newman dial in it, it would be around $500,000. And you could have picked out either one. This watch, as it is, goes for around like 70, 75. So if you were lucky enough to pick out the exotic dial one, you're a happy camper.
But even that one is beautiful, and especially for $75,000. I mean, that's a great watch, And compared to some models that are available today at $75,000, I would rather have one of those because it's iconic. It's historical. I mean,
right? Yeah, that's why you see a lot of. Sorry to trail off that final thought. You see a lot of celebrities gravitating towards this in the 6263, which is basically just this with a black Bakelite bezel, the big red model, or just similar models to that are non-Newmans. And there's. I just saw the guy from Ozark. Jesus, I'm blanking on his name. There's a picture of Jason Bateman floating around. He wears a 6263 as his daily watch. A bunch of celebrities that they love this model because it's classic, iconic. Not too many people know it compared to like a modern Daytona, so it's a little more under the radar, and it's not as crazy expensive as a Paul Newman.
Awesome. tell me, where can our listeners, our viewers find you?
You can find me on Instagram at MentoWatches, my website, mentowatches.com. I have a small YouTube channel that Roman yells at me that I don't work on enough, and I'm going to get back on that for 2023, I promise. But yeah, if you're interested, just drop us a line on Instagram or through our website.
Awesome. Adam, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really hope you enjoyed just talking about the same thing you recently talked to GQ about. But I think our listeners are going to enjoy hearing this, how this watching, the whole process that it went through to get onto Drake's wrist, obviously the numbers. And if you are listening to this, if you are watching this, please make sure to show us that you are into this. Like, subscribe, review, comment, do whatever you got to do to show us that this is your thing, and we'll continue doing them. Adam, have a great day. I hope you have a good week. I will talk to you
too,
later.
brother. Bye. Thanks.